The clock on the wall showed 9:30 p.m. when David pushed his cleaning cart through the backstage doors of the Grand Symphony Hall. Just like every other night for the past 8 years, he was invisible. Musicians rushed past him carrying instrument cases, their fancy clothes rustling as they headed home after another successful performance. Not one of them looked his way. David didn't mind. He preferred it this way. Being invisible meant he could do his job without interruption, and more importantly, it meant he could listen. Tonight had been a Beethoven concert. The sounds still echoed in his mind as he began collecting programs from the red velvet seats. The way the pianist had handled the Emperor Concerto made his heart ache with both admiration and longing. Every note had been precise yet filled with emotion. David could still hear it playing in his head as he worked his way down each row. He had started working here when he was 28 years old. Back then, his hair was darker and his hands weren't as rough from years of cleaning. The job was supposed to be temporary, just something to pay the bills while he figured out his next move. But temporary had stretched into 8 long years, and now he couldn't imagine working anywhere else. The truth was, David loved this place more than any of the performers who graced its stage. He knew every corner, every creak in the floorboards, every way the acoustics changed depending on where you stood. He had memorized the schedule by heart. Monday nights were usually chamber music. Tuesdays brought the youth orchestra. Wednesdays were rehearsal nights for the main symphony. And weekends were reserved for the big performances that drew crowds from across the city. As he emptied trash cans in the lobby, David caught himself humming the melody from tonight's concerto. His fingers moved slightly as if playing invisible keys. This was his secret habit, one he had developed over years of listening to countless rehearsals and performances. While he cleaned, he would imagine himself at the piano, his fingers dancing across the keys, just like the professionals he watched from the shadows. The cleaning routine was always the same. Start with the lobby, move to the seating area, then finish with the stage itself. The stage was David's favorite part of the night. When the hall was empty and the lights were dimmed, he could pretend for just a few minutes that this magical space belonged to him, too. Tonight, as he wheeled his cart onto the stage, the grand piano sat waiting. It was a beautiful Steinway, black as midnight and polished to perfection. The lid was still open from the performance, and the bench was pushed back slightly where the pianist had left it. David approached it carefully, almost reverently. He looked around to make sure he was alone, then gently ran his finger along the piano's edge. The wood was smooth and cool to the touch. He had cleaned around this instrument hundreds of times, but he never got tired of looking at it. Sometimes he wondered what it would feel like to actually sit at the bench, to place his hands on those keys and hear the sound ring out across the empty hall. But David knew his place. He was the janitor. His job was to clean, not to dream. As he dusted the bench and the music stand, memories drifted through his mind. He remembered being 7 years old, pressing his small fingers against the keys of an old upright piano in his grandmother's living room. She had been his first teacher, showing him how to find middle C and teaching him simple songs. "Music is magic," she used to say, her eyes twinkling. "It can heal hearts and change lives." Those piano lessons had continued through his childhood and teenage years. Different teachers, different pianos, but always the same feeling of joy when he played. His high school music teacher had told his parents that he had real talent, that with the right training he could maybe even become a professional musician. For a brief moment, that future had seemed possible, but life has a way of changing plans. College was expensive and his family didn't have much money. Instead of music school, David found himself working construction during the day and taking community college classes at night. The piano lessons stopped, replaced by the need to earn money and help his family pay bills. Still, he never stopped loving music. He would save up to buy cheap tickets to concerts, sitting in the back rows and watching the performers with wonder. He bought books about music theory and practiced on an old keyboard he found at a garage sale. It wasn't the same as playing a real piano, but it kept his dreams alive, even if just barely. When he saw the job posting for a night janitor at the Symphony Hall, David knew he had to apply. The pay wasn't great, but it would put him close to the music he loved. What he hadn't expected was how much the job would teach him. 8 years of listening to rehearsals and performances had been like getting a free education. He learned to recognize different composers just by their style. He could tell when musicians were having an off night or when they were truly inspired. He absorbed everything, filing it away in his mind like a musical library. During his breaks, David would sometimes sit in the back row of the empty hall and close his eyes. In his imagination, he would conduct entire symphonies, his hands moving through the air as the music played in his head. Sometimes he would picture himself at the piano, playing the pieces he had heard performed dozens of times. His fingers would move automatically, remembering patterns and melodies even though they had never actually played them. The other janitors thought he was a bit odd. They would chat about sports or TV shows during their breaks. But David preferred to listen to the music drifting from the practice rooms. They called him the quiet one and eventually stopped trying to include him in their conversations. That was fine with David. Their chatter would only distract from the beautiful sounds that filled the building each night. As David finished cleaning the stage, he allowed himself one last look at the piano. In a few hours, the sun would rise and the building would fill with people again. Musicians would arrive for morning rehearsals. Administrative staff would busy themselves with paperwork, and the magic of the empty hall would fade away. But for now, in these quiet hours after midnight, the music belonged to him too, even if he was just the janitor. Even if he was invisible to everyone else, David felt connected to something bigger than himself. The music that filled these walls during the day stayed with him through the night, keeping him company as he worked. He switched off the stage lights and headed toward the storage room to put away his supplies. Tomorrow night there would be another performance, more beautiful music to listen to, and another chance to dream. It was enough, David told himself. It had to be enough. After all, he was just the janitor. December 15th was different from any other night David had experienced at the Symphony Hall. Instead of the usual quiet emptiness after a performance, the building buzzed with laughter and conversation. The annual staff holiday party was in full swing, and for once, David wasn't invisible. He had tried to avoid the party altogether. When his supervisor told him he was expected to attend, David felt his stomach twist with anxiety. "It's mandatory for all employees," she had said with a smile. "Besides, it's time you met some of the people you work alongside every day." David stood in the corner of the main lobby, holding a plastic cup of punch and watching the festivities from a safe distance. Musicians he had observed for years were now laughing and telling stories just a few feet away. The serious violinist who always practiced late on Thursday nights was now doing impressions of famous conductors. The pianist who had played Beethoven so beautifully just last week was engaged in an animated conversation about holiday cookies. It felt strange to see them as regular people instead of the musical gods he had built them up to be in his mind. They talked about traffic jams and grocery shopping, complained about their neighbors, and argued about sports teams. They were just human beings like him. "Hey, you're the night janitor, right?" David nearly jumped out of his skin. A tall man with graying hair had approached him. David recognized him immediately. It was Robert, the concertmaster, the lead violinist who had been with the symphony for over 15 years. "Yes, sir," David replied quietly, gripping his cup tighter. "I've seen you around but never really had a chance to say hello. I'm Robert." He extended his hand with a friendly smile. David shook it awkwardly. "David. Well, David, are you enjoying the party?" Before David could answer, a group of musicians joined them. They had clearly been enjoying the open bar, their faces flushed with alcohol and holiday cheer. David recognized most of them. The second violinist, a flute player, the principal cellist, and 2 members of the brass section. "Robert, who's your friend?" asked the flute player, a woman with short blonde hair. "This is David, our night janitor. I was just introducing myself." "Oh," said the cellist a bit too loudly. "You're the guy who cleans up after us." "We never get to see the mysterious night shift workers." David felt his cheeks burn. He mumbled something about needing to get back to work, but Robert placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Nonsense, the party's just getting started. Besides, when do any of us get a chance to socialize with the people who keep this place running?" What started as friendly conversation gradually shifted into something that made David increasingly uncomfortable. The musicians began asking him questions about his life, his background, his interests. Their curiosity seemed genuine at first, but as they drank more, their questions became more pointed. "So what did you do before this?" asked the flute player. "Different jobs," David answered vaguely. "Come on, surely you have some hobbies," pressed the second violinist. "What do you do for fun?" David shrugged. "I like music." This statement caused a ripple of laughter through the group. "Of course you do," said the cellist with a grin. "You're surrounded by it every day. Do you play any instruments?" David felt trapped. He could feel all their eyes on him, waiting for his answer. "A little piano," he admitted quietly. "A little piano," exclaimed Robert with delight. "How wonderful! You know, we should get you to play something for us." "Oh, no," David said quickly, shaking his head. "I'm not that good. I just play for myself sometimes." But the musicians were warming to the idea. The alcohol had made them bold and silly, and the thought of getting the janitor to perform seemed hilarious to them. "Come on," urged the brass player. "It's a party. Everyone should contribute something." "I bet he can't even play chopsticks," laughed the second violinist. "No offense, David, but there's a difference between listening to music and actually playing it." The comment stung more than David cared to admit. These people had no idea what he was capable of, what he had studied, what dreams he had buried deep inside. To them, he was just a janitor who happened to like music. "I really should get back to work," David said, trying to back away from the group. "Work can wait," said Robert, though his tone was still friendly. "The party's only once a year. Besides, the piano's right there." He gestured toward the grand piano that had been moved into the lobby as decoration for the party. More staff members had gathered around now, drawn by the commotion. David found himself surrounded by faces he recognized but had never spoken to. Box office workers, administrative assistants, ushers, even some board members. They all seemed amused by the idea of the quiet janitor playing piano. "This should be interesting," someone whispered. "I wonder if he even knows how to sit on the bench properly," said another voice, followed by more laughter. David felt his face burning with embarrassment. These people had no malicious intent. They were just having fun at a holiday party. But their amusement felt like mockery to him. They saw him as entertainment, an amusing sideshow for their party. "Please," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I really can't." "Oh, come on," said the flute player, her voice slurred slightly. "Don't be shy. We promise not to laugh. Too much." The crowd chuckled at this, and David felt smaller with each passing second. He looked around desperately for an escape route, but he was completely surrounded. The piano sat in the center of the lobby like a challenge, its black surface gleaming under the party lights. "Tell you what," said Robert, trying to be encouraging. "Just play one song. Anything you want. Think of it as your contribution to the holiday festivities." The crowd began to chant softly, "Play, play, play." David closed his eyes and took a deep breath. His hands were shaking now, and his heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. Part of him wanted to run, to push through the crowd and disappear into the night. But another part of him, a part that had been silent for too long, began to stir. These people thought he was just a janitor. They thought he couldn't really play. They saw him as a joke, a bit of entertainment for their party. Maybe it was time to show them who he really was. "Okay," David said quietly. The crowd cheered and began to part, creating a path to the piano. David walked slowly across the lobby, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. He had dreamed of playing this piano for 8 years, but never like this, never with dozens of people watching and waiting for him to fail. He reached the bench and paused, looking down at the keys. They seemed to glow in the party lights, ivory and ebony waiting for his touch. Behind him, the crowd had grown quiet, anticipating the show. David sat down on the bench and adjusted its height slightly. The motion was automatic, muscle memory from years of piano lessons and practice. He placed his hands in his lap and looked out at the faces watching him. Some seemed genuinely curious, others barely contained their amusement. All of them expected very little. He turned back to the piano and slowly lifted his hands to the keys. His fingers found their positions automatically, left hand in the bass, right hand ready for melody. For a moment, he just sat there, feeling the weight of all those eyes on his back. Then, with a trembling finger, he pressed down on middle C. The note rang out clear and pure in the suddenly silent lobby. It held in the air for what felt like forever, a single perfect sound that seemed to stop time itself. In that moment, everything changed. That single note hung in the air like magic. For a moment, David just sat there, his finger still touching the key. The sound seemed to echo not just through the lobby, but through his entire soul. It had been so long since he had touched a real piano, and the feeling was overwhelming. Behind him, the crowd was completely silent. They were probably expecting him to stumble through Happy Birthday, or maybe attempt Twinkle. Twinkle, Little Star? David could almost feel their amused anticipation, waiting for the entertainment to begin, but something was happening inside David that he hadn't expected. As that first note faded away, 8 years of suppressed longing came rushing to the surface. All those nights of listening from the shadows, all those melodies he had hummed while cleaning, all those dreams he had pushed down deep inside, they were all fighting to get out. His left hand moved almost without his permission, finding the opening bass notes of a piece he had never played on a real piano but knew by heart. Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. He had listened to it performed in this very hall at least a dozen times, had practiced it on his old keyboard until his fingers could play it in his sleep. The deep, rolling notes filled the lobby with a richness that no electronic keyboard could ever produce. David closed his eyes and let muscle memory take over. His right hand joined in, beginning the haunting melody that made this piece one of the most beloved in all of classical music. The transformation was immediate and complete. The nervous, trembling janitor disappeared, replaced by someone the crowd had never seen before. David's posture straightened, his breathing deepened, and his entire being seemed to flow into the music. His fingers moved across the keys with the confidence of someone who had been born to play. The opening section of the ballade is deceptively gentle, almost like a lullaby. David played it with such tenderness that several people in the crowd found themselves holding their breath. This wasn't what they had expected at all. This wasn't some amateur stumbling through a simple tune. This was real music, played by someone who understood it completely. Behind him, David could sense the shift in the crowd's energy. The giggles and whispered comments had stopped. Even the people who had been chatting in the background had gone quiet. The entire lobby was focused on the sound coming from the piano. As the piece progressed, David's playing became more intense. The ballade tells a story without words, moving from gentle beauty to passionate drama and back again. David had always felt connected to this piece because it seemed to mirror his own life. Moments of joy and hope followed by struggle and loss, but always with the possibility of redemption. His technique was flawless. Years of practice on an inferior instrument had actually made his fingers stronger and more precise. When he finally got to play on a real piano, every note sang with clarity and purpose. The piano responded to his touch like it had been waiting for him all these years. The first major climax of the piece arrived, and David's hands moved in perfect coordination, creating layers of melody and harmony that filled every corner of the lobby. Some people in the crowd were starting to realize that what they were witnessing was extraordinary. This wasn't just good playing, this was professional-level performance. Robert, the concertmaster, had stopped breathing altogether. He had heard this piece performed by world-class pianists on this very piano, and David's interpretation was holding its own against any of them. His fingering was perfect, his phrasing was mature and thoughtful, and his technical skill was undeniable. The flute player who had been making jokes earlier was now staring with her mouth open. She had studied at some of the best music schools in the country, and she recognized true talent when she heard it. This janitor, this quiet man they had all ignored for years, was playing at a level that most music students could only dream of reaching. As David continued through the piece, tears began to stream down his face. He wasn't crying from sadness or embarrassment anymore. These were tears of pure joy, the release of emotions he had kept bottled up for far too long. For 8 years he had been a ghost in this building, invisible and silent. But now, finally, his voice was being heard. The music swelled and surged around him. The ballade's middle section is technically demanding, requiring both hands to play independent melodies while maintaining the overall structure of the piece. David navigated it effortlessly, his years of secret practice finally paying off. Every dynamic change, every subtle shift in tempo, every emotional nuance, it was all there. Played with the skill of someone who had lived inside this music for years. People in the crowd were beginning to whisper to each other, but not in mockery anymore. They were asking each other if they were really seeing what they thought they were seeing. How could the janitor play like this? Where had he learned? Why had he never said anything? The administrative assistant who handled artist contracts was mentally comparing David's playing to the guest pianists they hired for concerts. In her professional opinion, his performance was easily on par with musicians who charged thousands of dollars per appearance. One of the board members, a woman who had donated millions to the symphony over the years, found herself crying. She had attended hundreds of performances in her lifetime. But there was something about this moment, seeing such incredible talent emerge from the most unexpected place, that moved her more than any concert she had ever witnessed. David reached the final section of the ballade, where Chopin brings all the musical themes together in a breathtaking conclusion. His playing became even more intense, his whole body swaying with the music. The piano seemed to sing under his touch, producing sounds that filled the lobby with pure emotion. The technical demands of the ending are enormous, rapid scales, powerful chords, and delicate touches all woven together in a tapestry of sound that tests even the most skilled pianists. David met every challenge without hesitation. His fingers flew across the keys with precision and power, building to the dramatic final moments of the piece. As the last notes faded away, David slowly lifted his hands from the keys. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Not a single person in the crowd moved or spoke. They were all trying to process what they had just witnessed. David turned around on the bench to face the crowd, and that's when everyone could see the tears on his face. But these weren't tears of shame or embarrassment. His expression was one of pure relief, as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The silence stretched on for what felt like minutes. Then, slowly, Robert began to clap. His applause was joined by others, and soon the entire lobby erupted in thunderous approval. People were cheering, some were crying, and everyone was staring at David with a mixture of amazement and confusion. "Who are you?" Robert asked, his voice barely audible over the applause. "I mean, who are you, really?" David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and looked around at all the faces staring at him. For 8 years, these people had walked past him without a second glance. Now they were looking at him like they were seeing him for the first time. "I'm just the janitor," David said quietly, but his voice carried a new strength that hadn't been there before. The crowd began to quiet down, but the questions were just beginning. How long had he been playing? Where had he studied? Why was he working as a janitor if he could play like that? David stood up from the piano bench, suddenly feeling exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried him through the performance was wearing off, and the reality of what had just happened was starting to sink in. His secret was out. There was no going back to being invisible now. But as he looked around at the faces surrounding him, faces filled with respect and admiration instead of mockery, David realized that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to stop hiding. The days following the holiday party were unlike anything David had ever experienced. For 8 years, he had walked through the symphony hall like a ghost, but now, everywhere he went, people stopped to talk to him. Musicians who had never acknowledged his existence were suddenly his best friends. Administrative staff who had looked right through him were now greeting him by name, but David found their attention overwhelming. He wasn't used to being the center of anyone's universe, and he certainly wasn't comfortable with all the questions. The same questions over and over again. Where did you learn to play like that? Why didn't you tell anyone? How long have you been hiding this talent? Robert, the concertmaster, was the most persistent. 3 days after the party, he cornered David in the hallway during his shift. I can't stop thinking about your performance, Robert said, blocking David's path with his cleaning cart. I've been playing violin for 30 years and I know talent when I see it. You didn't just play that piece, you lived it. That kind of interpretation doesn't come from nowhere. David tried to move around him, but Robert wasn't giving up easily. Look, I understand if you're shy about it, but I really think we should talk. The symphony is always looking for talented musicians. Maybe we could arrange an audition or— I'm just the janitor, David interrupted, the same words he had used at the party. But they sounded hollow now, even to him. No, Robert said firmly. Janitors don't play Chopin like that. I've heard that ballad performed by students from Juilliard who couldn't touch what you did the other night. So please help me understand. Who are you really? That evening, David found himself sitting in an all-night diner with Robert and 2 other musicians from the symphony. He hadn't planned on it, but they had literally followed him after his shift ended, refusing to leave him alone until he agreed to talk. I went to Juilliard, David said quietly, staring into his coffee cup. The words felt strange coming out of his mouth. He hadn't said them out loud in years. The 3 musicians exchanged glances. Juilliard was one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. Getting accepted there was a dream that most musicians never achieved. When? Asked Lisa, the flute player who had been at the party. I graduated 22 years ago. David's voice was barely above a whisper. 22 years ago? Robert leaned forward in disbelief. David, if you graduated from Juilliard 22 years ago, you would have been, what, 22? 23? You could have had any career you wanted. What happened? David had never told this story to anyone. For over 2 decades, he had carried it inside him like a weight that grew heavier every year. But something about sitting in that diner, surrounded by people who understood music the way he did, made it feel safe to finally let it out. I was 22 when I graduated, David began slowly. I had a full scholarship, graduated summa cum laude, and I was good. Really good. My professors said I had the potential for a major international career. I had already started getting attention from agents and managers. There was talk of recording contracts, concert tours, all of it. He paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. My graduation recital was in May. By July, I had 3 auditions lined up with major orchestras. I was going to be a soloist, maybe record albums, play in Carnegie Hall someday. It was everything I had worked for since I was 7 years old. So what happened? Lisa asked gently. My mother got sick. The words came out flat and matter-of-fact, but David's eyes were filling with tears. Really sick. Pancreatic cancer. The doctor said she had maybe 6 months, a year at most if she was lucky. The table fell silent. Everyone understood where this story was going, and nobody wanted to hear it. She was all I had, David continued. My father had left when I was 10, and my mom worked 2 jobs to pay for my piano lessons. She sacrificed everything so I could go to Juilliard. When I got the scholarship, she cried for 3 hours straight. She was so proud. David wiped his eyes with a napkin. But the tears kept coming. The auditions were all in New York. The opportunities, the teachers who wanted to work with me, the whole music world, it was all there. But my mom was here and she was dying. The doctor said she needed someone with her full time. She didn't have insurance that covered home care, and I couldn't afford to hire anyone. Robert reached across the table and squeezed David's shoulder. As a musician himself, he understood the magnitude of what David was describing. These kinds of opportunities didn't come twice in a lifetime. So I came home, David said simply. I turned down the auditions, broke my contracts, and moved back in with my mom. I got a job at a construction company during the day so I could be with her at night. The piano became secondary. How long? Asked Tom, the cellist who had been quiet until now. She lived for 3 years. 3 years longer than the doctors thought she would. I like to think that having me there helped, you know. We spent a lot of time together. I would play piano for her sometimes, on this old upright she had bought at a garage sale. She always said my music was better than any medicine. David smiled slightly at the memory, but it was a sad smile. When she finally passed away, I was 25. I hadn't touched a professional piano in 3 years. I had no connections left in the music world. The agents who had been interested in me had moved on to younger talents. The opportunities were gone. But you could have tried again, Lisa said. 25 isn't too old to restart a career. David shook his head. You don't understand how competitive that world is. 3 years might as well be 30 years. While I was taking care of my mom, hundreds of other talented pianists were building careers, making connections, getting the opportunities I had turned down. The music world doesn't wait for anyone. What did you do? Robert asked. I tried for a while. I went to a few auditions, sent out demo recordings, contacted old professors, but it was like I had never existed. People were polite, but they weren't interested in some unknown pianist with no recent performance history. I wasn't a promising young talent anymore. I was just another musician looking for work. David ran his hands through his hair, the memories clearly painful. So I gave up. I told myself that music was just a hobby now, something I did for myself. I got regular jobs, construction, restaurant work, retail. I moved from place to place, never staying anywhere too long. I bought a cheap keyboard and practiced sometimes, but it felt pointless. How did you end up here? Tom asked. 8 years ago, I was living in a tiny apartment and working at a warehouse. I was barely making ends meet, and I was miserable. Then I saw the job posting for a night janitor at the Symphony Hall. It didn't pay much more than the warehouse, but David gestured around him as if the diner were the concert hall. But it would put you close to music again, Robert finished. Exactly. I thought maybe if I could just be around it, even if I wasn't performing, it would be enough. I could listen to rehearsals, hear great music every day, and maybe that would fill the hole that giving up my career had left. And did it? Lisa asked. David was quiet for a long moment. For a while, yes. It was better than nothing. I learned so much just from listening. I heard pieces I had never encountered in school, watched musicians work through difficult passages, absorbed everything like a sponge. In some ways, those 8 years were like getting a master class in music every single night. But it wasn't enough, was it? Robert said quietly. No, David admitted. It wasn't. Every night I would go home and look at my keyboard, and I would think about what could have been. I would imagine myself on that stage instead of cleaning it. Some nights I would play for hours, just trying to keep my skills from completely disappearing. But it was torture, you know? Like being hungry and only being allowed to smell food. The four of them sat in silence for a while, processing the weight of David's story. Here was a man who had sacrificed his dreams for love, who had given up a potentially brilliant career to care for his dying mother. It was both heartbreaking and inspiring. David, Robert said finally, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Do you still have it? The talent, I mean. After 22 years of not performing professionally, after all this time, could you still do it? David looked up at him, and for the first time since he started telling his story, there was a spark in his eyes. When I played that Chopin at the party, he said, it felt like coming home, like waking up after a very long sleep. My fingers remembered everything, every technique, every piece I had ever learned. If anything, I think I understand the music better now than I did when I was 22. Life experience has a way of deepening your interpretation. Robert smiled. Then maybe it's not too late after all. News travels fast in the music world, especially news as surprising as a janitor playing Chopin at a professional level. Within a week of that conversation at the diner, David's phone started ringing with calls he never expected to receive. The first call came from a local music journalist who had heard the story from someone at the symphony. She wanted to write an article about David's background and his incredible performance at the holiday party. David was terrified by the idea, but Robert convinced him to do the interview. Your story needs to be told, Robert said during one of their daily conversations. There are probably dozens of talented musicians out there who think their dreams are over because life got in the way. You could inspire them. The article appeared in the city's arts newspaper 2 weeks later. The headline read, The Janitor Who Played Chopin, a Juilliard graduate's journey from concert halls to cleaning supplies. David cringed when he saw it, but the response was overwhelmingly positive. Within days, the story had been picked up by larger newspapers and music magazines. Social media was buzzing with videos that people had secretly recorded at the holiday party. Someone had filmed David's entire performance on their phone, and the video was being shared thousands of times. But it wasn't just media attention that David was getting. Real opportunities were starting to present themselves. The first serious offer came from the artistic director of a small concert series in the next city over. She had read the article and watched the video, and she wanted David to perform a solo recital. The fee wasn't huge, but it would be his first professional performance in over 20 years. "I don't know if I'm ready," David told Robert, pacing nervously around the symphony hall's backstage area. Playing for drunk party guests is one thing. Playing a full recital for people who actually paid to hear me is completely different. "You're ready," Robert assured him. "I've heard you play. You're more than ready." David spent the next month preparing for the recital like his life depended on it. He practiced on the symphony hall's piano during his breaks, with permission from the management. Musicians would often stop to listen, offering encouragement and technical advice. The same people who had ignored him for 8 years were now invested in his success. The night of the recital arrived faster than David had expected. The venue was small, only about 200 seats, but it was completely sold out. Word had spread about the janitor-turned-pianist, and people were curious to see if the viral video had been a fluke. David stood backstage, wearing a rented tuxedo that felt foreign after years of work uniforms. His hands were shaking worse than they had at the holiday party. This was it, his chance to prove that he still belonged in the music world, or his chance to fail spectacularly in front of paying customers. 5 minutes. "Mr. David," the stage manager called. Robert appeared beside him, along with Lisa and several other musicians from the symphony who had driven over to support him. "How do you feel?" Lisa asked. "Like I'm about to throw up," David admitted. "Good," Robert said with a smile. "That means you care. The day you stop being nervous before a performance is the day you should quit." David walked onto the stage and was greeted by enthusiastic applause. Looking out at the audience, he saw faces of all ages, young music students, elderly classical music lovers, middle-aged professionals who had read his story in the paper. They were all there because they believed in second chances. He sat at the piano bench and adjusted it slightly, just like he had done thousands of times in practice rooms and at his mother's old upright piano. But this time was different. This time he wasn't hiding. David's program included the Chopin ballade that had started everything, along with pieces by Bach, Debussy, and Rachmaninoff. Each piece told part of his story, the technical precision he had learned in school, the emotional depth he had gained through life experience, and the pure joy of finally being able to share his gift with others. The performance was magical. David's technique was flawless, but more importantly, his playing had a maturity and emotional honesty that can only come from someone who has truly lived. When he played the slow movement of a Mozart sonata, you could hear the tenderness he had felt caring for his mother. When he tackled a difficult Rachmaninoff piece, you could feel the years of struggle and suppressed dreams. The audience was completely captivated. There were no coughs, no rustling programs, no whispered conversations. Everyone was hanging on every note, drawn into the story that David was telling without words. When he finished the final piece, the silence lasted for several seconds before the audience erupted in a standing ovation that went on for nearly 10 minutes. People were crying, cheering, and calling for encores. David played 3 additional pieces, each one greeted with more thunderous applause. After the concert, dozens of people waited to meet him. Music teachers wanted to book him for master classes. Concert promoters were handing him business cards. A record label representative was interested in discussing a recording contract, but the conversation that meant the most to David came from a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25. "I'm a pianist too," she said, tears in her eyes. "I graduated from music school 3 years ago, but I've been working at a coffee shop because I couldn't find any performance opportunities. Everyone told me I was too old to start a career, that I should find something more practical to do with my life. But after hearing you tonight, I think I'm going to start auditioning again." David felt his own eyes fill with tears. This was exactly what Robert had predicted. His story was inspiring other musicians who had given up on their dreams. Over the next few months, David's life changed completely. He was invited to perform with orchestras, gave master classes at universities, and even recorded an album of the pieces he had performed in his debut recital. Music critics praised his mature interpretation and emotional honesty, but David made sure to keep his day job at the Symphony Hall at least part-time. It wasn't because he needed the money anymore. His performance career was taking off faster than he had ever imagined. He kept the job because the symphony hall had been his refuge during the darkest years of his life, and he wanted to give back. Now, instead of just cleaning the concert hall, David also taught piano lessons to underprivileged kids in the community outreach program. He worked with adult students who had always dreamed of playing piano but thought they were too old to start. He mentored young musicians who were struggling to break into the professional world. On the first anniversary of his holiday party performance, the symphony held a special concert in David's honor. He performed as a soloist with the orchestra, playing the same Chopin ballade that had changed everything, but this time with full orchestral accompaniment. Before he played, David addressed the audience. "A year ago, I thought my story was over," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed concert hall. "I thought I had made my choice between music and family, and that I had to live with the consequences forever. But I learned something important. It's never too late to write a new chapter in your story." He looked out at the audience, which included his old construction co-workers, the journalists who had written about him, the young musicians he now mentored, and dozens of other people whose lives had been touched by his story. "Dreams don't have expiration dates," David continued. "Sometimes they get delayed. Sometimes they take a different form than we expected. But they don't disappear. They wait for us, sometimes for decades, until we're ready to pursue them again." As David played that night, with the full symphony supporting him, he thought about his mother. He could almost hear her voice saying what she had always said when he was young. "Music is magic. It can heal hearts and change lives." She had been right. Music had changed his life, just not in the way either of them had expected. It had taught him about sacrifice and love, about patience and hope, and ultimately about the power of second chances. The janitor who had once been invisible was now inspiring audiences around the world. But more importantly, he was inspiring people to believe that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be.